Programmable instruments are a measure of value. 1. DSO, Decentralized Social Organization. 2. Multiple dimension programmable instruments. 3. The power of the programmable instrument and the debt instruments. 4. Multidimensional programmable instruments and stakeholders. And 5. Conclusion. A decentralized social organization, DSO, was introduced as a variant of a decentralized autonomous organization, DAO, DAO, with the key difference that, unlike in a DAO, where there is an instinct for code is law, the DSO embraces human interpretation and decision-making, which are then captured through a governance process on a blockchain. This was further developed in the discussion around what a public permissioned blockchain would look like, describing self-sovereign groups and the possibility of setting permissions on financial instruments that are only tradable within the permissioned groups. We can extend this idea to other areas in finance. Let's imagine that mortgages are tokenized as smart contracts in their own right. We then apply the concept of ESG, where the more energy efficient houses generate environmental credits, or occupancy rates are tied to social credits. The mortgage holders are incentivized to provide the information, and there may be verification of the data done to prove it is correct. If we were to package mortgages into mortgage-backed securities, we combine the credit rating with the ESG ratings, which again becomes interesting how the effect of a higher ESG rating would affect the demand and thus the price of the bond. The power of the programmable instrument is in the verifiable outcomes, which result in the issuance of credits. There are two approaches to the verification process. Either the issuer specifies which independent auditor or authority verifies the data, or the DSO framework is used, where self-sovereign groups are formed to verify the data. The groups have incentives to verify, and there are punishment mechanisms in place if the verifiers behave maliciously. In an ideal world, all debt is repaid. And while there are mechanisms such as pledging collateral to cover defaults, over-collateralization would make the borrowing unviable. We recognize that loan defaults happen, and that is built into the credit scoring, and thus the rate of interest the issuer needs to pay. What happens to the ESG credits in the event of a default? If the ESG credits are issued throughout the life cycle of the instrument, then the ones created before the default event are still valid. There may need some intervention. For example, if the electric car manufacturer issued a social credit for every 5,000 cars sold to a car sharing club. The last issuance was at 15,000 units, and the default occurred when the manufacturer had reached 18,250 units. Should there be a partial credit issued, or are they only issued every 5,000 no matter what? Debt instruments have a use for governments and corporations to borrow money for a fixed time period and use the money for specific projects or activities. So far, we have looked at a subset of finance, specifically debt instruments, and how we can add further dimensions such as ESG credits. Multidimensional programmable instruments and stakeholders. Equity as an asset class is a challenge for creating programmable instruments. Unlike most debt instruments where there is a fixed schedule, equities have no end date. The distribution of profits through dividends is variable, And as an asset class, it already has two dimensions, capital value and ownership rights. The ownership rights vary from company to company, and on the share class, however, in principle, there is the right to vote at meetings such as the annual general meetings, AGM, which will have motions to approve board appointments, remuneration of the executives, and the dividend payments. The life cycle of an equity can be more complex than a debt instrument, as equities can be subject to rights issues, mergers and acquisitions, and stock splits. To program all these event types, an outcome is possible, but complex. There has been much debate in the last few about Milton Friedman's famous article in the New York Times, where he exhorted business leaders should ensure the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. The notion of maximizing shareholder returns is being challenged, and there are calls for companies to be run for the benefit of all stakeholders, namely customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. In theory, all that would need to happen is for the executive team to consider all the stakeholders and for the shareholders to support it. They would publish the annual report with sections covering the various stakeholders and how they benefited each group. The downside to this is that is buried in a report and not a standard set of benchmarks and verified measurements which can be used to rate the company and compare them with their peers. It would be possible to construct a programmable stakeholder instrument which would contain the necessary elements for each stakeholder. The shareholders have an equity element, which is the vehicle that has the voting rights, pays the dividends, and is subject to the corporate actions. The community element will have information around social schemes such as mentoring disadvantaged school children, volunteer working, or financial support to community projects which have benchmarks set and whether they were achieved, thus issuing social or stakeholder credits. The suppliers element is a set of metrics around prompt payment according to the target payment dates, number of disputes which feed into a stakeholder credit. The customers element based on targeted and verified satisfaction ratings, which when achieved generate stakeholder credits. As we saw with the programmable debt instruments, there are external activities which prompt the issuance of credit tokens, ESG. The importance of the external data in issuing the credits means that it needs verifying. As suggested, this is a self-sovereign group based on a DSO model, which has the right incentives and degrees of punishments for transgression of the rules. It could be an interesting incentive for organizations if the stakeholder credits had a half-life and decayed in value over time. This would provide a strong incentive for companies to work hard in achieving or exceeding their set stakeholder objectives. The accumulation of stakeholder credits along with the financial returns in a programmable instrument creates a statement of value which considers a range of dimensions rather than purely on the maximization of profit. There are accusations of greenwash around ESG and that the stakeholder focus is nothing but a PR stunt. The mechanism of a DSO and programmable instruments provide the framework for verifiable outputs that are compared to the objective set and thus form a stronger foundation for creating real value beyond the simple outputs of traditional financial instruments. Thank you for watching, everyone, and hope to see you at T-Grade Social Networks. Bye.